Just again, what's the subject of this lecture? You didn't read?
This is the one about managing the political aspects.
Dando continuidade, compõe a mesa diretora dos trabalhos os excelentíssimos senhores, juiz de direito Bruno Bodar e o professor doutor da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Harvard, Matthew Stephenson.
Bom dia a todos. Gostaria, primeiramente, de agradecer a presença de vocês. And also to thank Professor Matthew again. It's an honor to have him here. O professor pediu para que as pessoas viessem mais para frente, para as cadeiras da frente, porque a proposta é haver uma interação entre a plateia e o professor, e também que evitem a utilização do telefone celular durante a sessão. O tema de hoje será a gestão dos aspectos políticos, né, das operações de combate à corrupção, e eu desde logo passo a palavra ao professor Matthew para iniciar.
Before I get started, I'm going to speak from up here as before, but then I'm going to go down there and I will probably need a microphone. Do we have that somewhere?
A gente precisa de microfone.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I now feel like I'm keeping everyone from their coffee, so I feel a little bit self-conscious. But again, my jokes in the morning never get a laugh. It really worries me. But then when I joke about the joke not getting a laugh, that gets a laugh. So that's at least a start. People seem really tired. Is everyone really tired this morning? People look really tired. All right. Anyway, so I'm going to say again and repeat what Bruno had to say. As you know, I assume most people were here yesterday. This is not a lecture. This is meant to be a discussion. I originally had planned this as a seminar. Of course, our group is larger than initially anticipated, so it's a bit different. But I'm not going to be talking at you. I'm going to just say a few words by way of introduction, and the hope is to begin a conversation. And in order for that to be most effective, it would be great if people were to come forward. There are all these empty seats here, so those you people in the back, come forward. This is not a lecture. All right. All right, so that didn't work at all, and nobody's moving. So I don't know. You guys are a tough audience. So anyway, without further ado, let me start again with my opening remarks for this session. Yesterday, we had a conversation about certain tools or techniques that anti-corruption prosecutors might deploy. And in particular, we were thinking about issues related to the choice of target as between individuals or corporations, the use or non-use of settlement instruments, the use or non-use of particular kinds of penalties like debarment. Today, I want to touch on, and again, I hope to provoke a conversation about another really important aspect of anti-corruption investigations, prosecutions, enforcement actions that's not as narrowly legal, not really about the choice of legal instruments, but more political and therefore more sensitive. But I think it's a topic that's worth having a serious conversation about, especially because I know that in Brazil, this is an issue that many people have discussed in the context of the most recent anti-corruption investigations, but more generally as well. And that's the political aspect of anti-corruption crackdowns. So, criminal justice is not supposed to be a partisan enterprise. Neither judges nor prosecutors are supposed to be partisan political actors. I think that's a proposition that would command a widespread agreement across many different countries, cultures, and systems. But the fact that there is widespread agreement on the fact that prosecutors and judges, and for that matter, police or other investigators, are not supposed to be partisan political actors, does not alter the fact that anti-corruption enforcement, especially when it targets or possibly might target senior political officials or their family members or close associates, are often highly politically significant. It's very difficult to disentangle, to fully separate the law enforcement dimension of anti-corruption from the political dimension of anti-corruption, which raises important questions for everybody, but maybe especially with this audience, it's worth emphasizing questions for prosecutors, investigators, and other enforcement agents about the right way to handle the inevitably political dimensions of anti-corruption. And the decision to entirely ignore the political dimensions of anti-corruption is itself a decision. That is a choice that one can make. So when I say that there's an inevitably political element to anti-corruption, obviously part of that is the fact that when there are allegations in the media or by law enforcement that senior political officials or their associates have violated the law by behaving corruptly, that has important political ramifications. But there are always, perhaps inevitably, concerns about whether the enforcement apparatus of the state, the prosecutors, judges, police, etc., have themselves been inappropriately influenced by political considerations. On the one hand, there is the frequent concern, and often the allegation, that certain powerful individuals have a kind of de facto impunity from accountability, criminal or otherwise, for corrupt acts, because the prosecutors won't go after them, the police won't investigate them, the judges won't convict them because of their political power or political connections or influence over the judicial system. So on the one hand, there's a concern that inappropriate political influence might prevent certain anti-corruption enforcement actions from taking place. But there's also the opposite issue, where there are concerns about unfair or politically motivated targeting of certain individuals or their associates for political reasons. There are concerns in some circumstances that prosecutors might be too willing to go after certain individuals, and judges perhaps might be too willing to punish them because of an alleged political bias against those individuals. That possibility we're reminded of constantly, because in virtually every case where a senior political official or that person's close family or associates are the target of an anti-corruption investigation or prosecution, those targets will allege that the prosecution is politically biased, that it's a politically motivated witch hunt is the metaphor that's often used in English language discussions. People will sometimes use the language of a coup, a prosecutorial or judicial coup. Other rhetoric is used in different contexts, but you can look across the world, many, many different systems. Any president or prime minister or senior politician or whomever is the subject of an anti-corruption probe will assert this is a politically biased, politically motivated attack on me because of my political views. Now, sometimes that claim that the anti-corruption prosecution is politically motivated is patently absurd. Sometimes you can look on the face of it and say it's just ridiculous, this is obviously nonsense. In other cases, it appears to be true. There are cases. I mean, one of the reasons this concern is troublesome is that there are real cases where anti-corruption prosecutions have been deployed deliberately to harass or, in some cases, incarcerate political opponents. When the Russian government arrests a leading Russian dissident whose main activity has been to expose corruption by the Russian government, when that person is arrested for corruption, I think there are reasons to suspect that this was a politically motivated prosecution. When the government of Saudi Arabia, when the new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia rounds up many of his rivals for power and charges them all with corruption and holds them until they're all willing to pay substantial sums of money and so on and so forth, I think many people look at that and say, that's an example of a politically motivated anti-corruption prosecution. This wasn't really about corruption, this was really about weakening political rivals. Even more challenging, there are situations in which Both narratives could be true, or they might be true at the same time. There are certainly situations in which we see anti-corruption probes where the targets are very likely corrupt. They're probably guilty. But at the same time, the selection of targets was probably not completely politically neutral. And probably politics played a big role in who got investigated and prosecuted for corruption. So many people would point these days to the People's Republic of China as an example where something like this may be going on. As many of you know, for Brazil over the last several years has had the largest anti-corruption probe of any democracy in the world. But China probably has had the largest anti-corruption crackdown of any non-democracy and probably any country in the world. That anti-corruption crackdown, which has led to the punishment of huge numbers of public officials and some private sector actors as well, has been plausibly characterized as, if not politically motivated, then at least politically biased in terms of the affiliation of the people, especially the high level of people who have been nailed in that campaign. At the same time, it does not appear that the Chinese government is making up fake allegations against people that it doesn't like. The people who are being purged in this anti-corruption crackdown really do seem to have behaved corruptly. And this is actually a phenomenon we see over and over again as well, where anti-corruption crackdowns are potentially politically biased, but at the same time really are holding accountable people who've engaged in significant acts of illegality and probably should be held accountable. Well, I think this is a real challenge. And I want to make this a little bit more specific. I think that for people who are working in the state law enforcement apparatus, whether it's for an anti-corruption agency or a prosecution office or a police service or what have you, I want to highlight what I see as three closely related but somewhat distinct challenges with respect to this inevitably political dimension of anti-corruption and these concerns about the politicization of anti-corruption. The first challenge is how to ensure that anti-corruption investigations and prosecutions are not politically biased. That may seem obvious, but the first challenge is how do we make sure through our institutions, through our norms, through our practices, that there is as little political bias in fact as is achievable in this area. Taking into account we're dealing with human beings, not robots, and it's very difficult to completely excise politics or people's political views from decision-making. The second challenge is how to maintain the public perception that anti-corruption investigations are unbiased, thereby preserving the legitimacy of the anti-corruption efforts. This is related to, but not the same as, ensuring that anti-corruption investigations and prosecutions are in fact not politically biased. Right? The fact that you might be entirely convinced there's no political bias whatsoever in the prosecution service does not guarantee that the public will share that view. And so it's not enough simply to ensure there's no actual bias in anti-corruption enforcement. It's also important to be attentive to the question of how we, you, the system, can convince the public, or a sufficient segment of the public, that there isn't serious political bias in anti-corruption enforcement in order to preserve the legitimacy of those enforcement efforts in an environment where the targets will always assert that the political bias is real in an attempt to undermine the credibility of the investigation. The third challenge is related to the second, but it's a little bit broader. Sometimes, in some environments, maintaining sufficient public or political support for the investigation is critical to resist attempts by political forces to undermine the investigation, potentially through illegal means, but potentially through nominally legal means, by passing new laws or restrictions or what have you, undermining the ability of anti-corruption enforcers to do their job. So in many environments, there's another challenge. The challenge is not just to maintain the appearance and the reality of political neutrality so that the enforcer's legitimacy is not undermined, but it's a more affirmative challenge to build or cultivate the kind of public support that will push back against, for example, attempts to pass amnesty laws to protect politically powerful actors, or to pass new procedural laws to make it much more difficult for the enforcers to do their job, or to remove key anti-corruption enforcement figures through nominally legal means. So just to give a couple of examples of this in my home country, as we mentioned yesterday, and as many of you are well aware, currently the President of the United States, possibly, and the President's close associates certainly, are under investigation for potentially illegal activity by a special counsel. Unlike Brazil, where my understanding, based on what I've learned over the last few days, is that the prosecution service is autonomous and independent as a matter of law. The President could not simply, in this country, could not simply fire a prosecutor simply because the President did not like what that prosecutor was doing. In the United States, although there are some statutory and regulatory protections, in fact, the President has a great deal of freedom to remove, or the President's political appointee, the Attorney General, could remove the special counsel. And it is really political pressure as much as legal barriers that ensures the independence of that investigation. This is true in other countries as well. One of my favorite examples is Indonesia, where they have an independent anti-corruption agency, which has been surprisingly effective in pursuing corruption by a number of officials at high levels, including the police. The police have pushed back very hard against the Anti-Corruption Commission and have sought, in certain cases, to undermine it, sometimes through legal means, but very often through illegal means, through conspiring to try to frame members of the commission to break their power. And the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission has survived so far because it has cultivated broad and strong public support. People come out in the street to protest when the independence of that agency is threatened. So again, for anti-corruption enforcers, this is, I would describe, a third kind of political challenge. The first is to ensure there's no actual political bias. The second is to maintain the perception of political neutrality. And the third, at least under some circumstances, is to maintain enough public support that the targets of investigations and their allies are not able to undermine those investigations through legal or illegal means. So I'm going to stop talking soon so we can turn it over to, I think, for me, the much more interesting and I hope more stimulating part of this conversation, which is really the conversation part. So, but I want to maybe transition to that part of our discussion by putting on the table a few more specific questions. And they're questions where I would really like to hear what you all have to say. I recognize it may be a little bit delicate since you all, well, not all of you, but many of you are prosecutors or judges, and I'm asking you to reflect openly about what you think about these very delicate issues regarding the conduct of prosecutors and to some extent judges, but I hope you'll be willing at least to talk about this at a general level, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about specific instances or specific cases. So the first question I want to put on the table for consideration is how much, if at all, should prosecutors consider political factors or public opinion-related factors when making decisions about whom to charge, when to charge them, and so forth. Now, one might instinctively say never, and that's possible. I remember sitting in a meeting once, a closed-door meeting with a number of prosecutors from many different parts of the world talking about these issues, and there were two prosecutors there, I remember, from different countries in Africa, and I won't name either country because it was a closed-door meeting, but one of those prosecutors said, I would never consider the political ramifications or the public interest ramifications when I decided which cases to bring or when to bring them. That would be an entirely illegitimate thing to do. I am not a political actor. To which one of his colleagues from another African country responded, of course I take those things into account. I may not say it publicly, but I would be a fool not to take those things into account. I have a young agency, a relatively weak agency. I have very powerful adversaries. I have to think like a politician, not just like a prosecutor, not just like a lawyer, if I want to be able to do my job and build up the strength of my agency. And so I do think there's an interesting question there. There's an interesting question about whether they say it out loud or not, whether prosecutors should sometimes think about the political environment in which they're operating, and whether that should in some circumstances influence the decisions they make at the margins. I don't think anyone would say a prosecutor should, be entirely political in choosing whom to charge, for example. But sometimes, I would imagine, you all are the experts, but from talking to prosecutorial friends, you have a case, the evidence is strong, but it's not an open and shut case. You could plausibly bring the case, but maybe you should wait. Maybe you should see if more evidence develops. And maybe one might consider the political ramifications of bringing the case when deciding when to go forward with a case at the margins or whether to wait, for example. So that's one question. Should prosecutors, the broadest question I'm going to ask, should prosecutors, at least in some circumstances, think politically, at least partially, as well as thinking legally? Is that ever justified, or should prosecutors always put politics entirely out of their minds and just bring the case if they think the evidence is there and they can get a conviction? Second question I want to put on the table for our discussion has to do with the way prosecutors in particular, most of what I'm saying will apply to prosecutors, maybe some of it might apply to judges or police as well, but I'm going to focus on prosecutors, and I'll include in that independent anti-corruption agencies of the sort you see in some other countries. How should they communicate with the public, if at all? What kind of public communication strategy is appropriate for prosecutors or others working on anti-corruption enforcement, especially when very high-level political officials are involved? And I do think this is an interesting question because if you look around the world, you see a range of different behaviors in this regard. So again, I'll start with my own country and use the Robert Mueller investigation of Donald Trump as an example. The norms in the US, which are exemplified by Special Counsel Mueller, are to say almost nothing to the public. Robert Mueller communicates what's going on in his investigation almost entirely through his court filings. He does not give press conferences. He very rarely issues statements. There was one issued recently because there had been an alleged leak of something important in the news that got a lot of attention, and a very rare move, his office released a letter saying that some of what had been reported in the media was inaccurate. And didn't go into details about how or in what ways it was inaccurate. But that got a lot of attention. Whoa, I mean, there was a letter from the Mueller office saying something. But for the most part, Robert Mueller's investigation has had no media presence or public communication whatsoever, at least not publicly. Some people say certain items have been deliberately leaked, but publicly, none whatsoever. And that's not out of the ordinary for US prosecutors. Indeed, the rules for ethical conduct for prosecutors, for the most part, prohibit them from from communicating about a case in ways that go beyond simply disclosing facts about the progress of the investigation, certainly would preclude them from making general political statements. In contrast, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to speak on a panel with Jose Ugaz, who was the ad hoc attorney for Peru in the prosecution of former President Alberto Fujimori and his close associates. And in a discussion, very much on the topic that I just put on the table, how do anti-corruption authorities going after senior political figures maintain their credibility when the targets claim this is all politically motivated? And certainly President Fujimori and his allies attacked Mr. Ugaz in the investigation, saying this was all political. This is all basically a left-wing attempt to unseat Fujimori. And Mr. Ugaz said, well, one of the things that I did is I held regular monthly press conferences where I would discuss the investigation and communicate with the public about what we were doing and why we were doing it. And of course, he said, I couldn't disclose a lot of details of the investigation. I couldn't compromise the investigation by saying too much, but I really tried to be very communicative with the public. And I mentioned the Indonesia example a moment ago. Indonesia's Special Anti-Corruption Agency has really cultivated the media. They have a press officer. They're regularly reaching out to civil society groups, to media groups, to present their side of the story, for example, in their conflict with the police force. A great deal of public outreach, quite different from what we see in the United States in the Mueller investigation. In Brazil, in the Lava Jato investigation, I have learned from my contact with people here, including people as part of the investigation, there's, if anything, an even more aggressive type of media outreach. There's the use of social media, of Twitter, of Instagram, of Facebook, to communicate with the public, including not only discussion of the case, but broader discussion of the larger context and the need for various kinds of political or legal reforms. So again, I'm hoping we can stimulate some discussion because I'd very much like to hear what you all have to say about this, especially since you all work in this area. There are a range of options for how prosecutors pursuing high-level anti-corruption can communicate with the public. There's probably no one right approach for all countries. It may be that Robert Mueller's approach is exactly the right approach for the United States, whereas Jose Ogaz's very different approach was the right approach for Peru. But I do think that's a question one needs to think about when considering the political ramifications of anti-corruption work. The third issue I want to put on the table is maybe a broader institutional issue, though it may also relate to the decisions of individual people, and I suspect this will likely have some resonance here right now. What do we think about prosecutors, or in some instances judges, who have been involved in anti-corruption cases going into politics? So this issue can manifest itself in a few different ways. One way it might manifest itself, it has to do with how we design the prosecution service and the expected careers of prosecutors. So in the United States, federal prosecutors are appointed, but they're part of a political process. There's not an autonomous service. They're appointed by political actors. At the state level, some prosecutors at the senior level are elected. It is quite common, even at the federal level, for those holding positions as prosecutors, as we would call them United States attorneys, to seek higher office, sometimes in electoral politics. So, for example, Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, who unsuccessfully ran for the Republican presidential nomination the last time around, came to public prominence as a United States attorney, as a federal prosecutor. And he is not unusual. Merrick Garland, who's a Court of Appeals judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Obama, although his nomination was blocked by the Senate Republicans. He became prominent as a federal prosecutor. He was the lead prosecutor in the terrorist attacks on a federal office building in Oklahoma City. It's quite common for U.S. prosecutors to seek higher office, to be appointed to be judges or to run for office. Well, in Europe, I am told, though I'm not an expert, but many European judges and others have explained to me that in Europe this is extremely uncommon, that the prosecution service is really a civil service branch. People get promoted up the hierarchy, but it's relatively uncommon for prosecutors to exit that civil service track and pursue a political career. And it's worth thinking about, from the perspective of anti-corruption, what are the advantages and disadvantages of these different kinds of systems? Do we want a system where individuals might think that a prominent position as a prosecutor and possibly involvement in an anti-corruption case might propel their political careers? Or do we want a situation in which the expectation is that prosecutors stay out of politics? And there's a trade-off here. On the one hand, there are great dangers to politicians being political actors, and those dangers are probably obvious. If you're concerned that anti-corruption prosecutions might be overly political, that prosecutors might be overly zealous, you might have that concern all the more intensely if the norms or expectations is that prosecutors, especially if they crack a big case, can go on to run for public office. You might also worry that even though the prosecution service is nominally nonpartisan, prosecutors who are thinking about a future political career, right, that, again, they're not robots. That might infect and potentially bias their judgment even if they're acting in good faith when they're choosing, who they might go after. So there are some real concerns from the perspective of anti-corruption of having a prosecution service where many people have an interest in either political careers or being appointed to the judiciary through a political process. On the other hand, there's a concern with the more traditional European civil service model that there will be excessive passivity and not enough enthusiasm about cracking the big case and taking down the big politicians. Because if you're a civil servant, that just creates headaches. There's no real personal advantage to doing it. And you might need people to have that extra motivation that comes from personal ambition to get them to do something that's really hard and really challenging and from a professional perspective, quite risky. At this same closed-door conference with all these prosecutors where the two gentlemen from Africa disagreed about whether they should be political, another participant in the conference described, in that person's perspective, the difference in the reaction between a U.S. prosecutor and a continental European prosecutor, if that prosecutor has land on her desk a file that indicates that a senior politician in the relevant jurisdiction may have engaged in serious wrongdoing. And the person said this kind of as a joke, but it's one of those jokes that captures a kernel of truth. The claim was the American prosecutor sees that file. It says a senior politician under your jurisdiction may have engaged in high-level corruption. The American's reaction is, yes, this could make my career. I'm really like, let's go. The reaction, the claim was of the stereotypical continental European prosecutor on seeing that same file, the equivalent file, is, oh no, this is really bad. I'm really scared. This is just going to be a huge headache. I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. So there may be this trade-off between a system that fosters a lot of autonomy, but may also foster maybe too much passivity, from a system that really harnesses people's personal ambitions in ways that may be good in some contexts, but may also have some not so positive consequences. And I want to maybe close my opening remarks by noting, and again, I know this may have resonance in Brazil, and those of you who did the reading will know what I'm alluding to if it's not already obvious. When an anti-corruption investigation already has developed a strongly partisan perception, whether fairly or unfairly, if there are maybe additional constraints that ought to be imposed on people who have been involved in those investigations, so as not, in terms of future political activity, so as not to compromise the perception that the investigation is politically neutral. And I don't have a position on this, but there is at least a plausible case to be made that there should be more either formal restrictions or informal understandings that those who have been involved in such cases might be extra cautious about becoming politically active. So instead of trying to go one issue at a time, I put all of these issues out on the table, but now I'm going to ramble on for just a few more minutes so you all know you should start thinking about the questions or interventions you want to make and be ready so we don't have dead silence. And I'm going to continue to talk for no particular reason for another 15 or 20 seconds so you can all have your questions ready, and I hope you're all doing it. But the point is, I want us to talk, well, I hope you will all want to talk. This is your time more than it is my time. I hope you will be willing to share your views on, again, these three principal questions I want to put on the table. First is, how much or to what extent or how should prosecutors consider the political context of their anti-corruption decision-making? Second, how, if at all, should prosecutors communicate with the general public on that continuum from completely tight-lipped to tweeting 7 times a day? And third, what do we think about those who've been involved in anti-corruption investigations as prosecutors or judges pursuing either a political career or a career that implicates the political process? Should that be restricted? Should it be the norm? And I'm very interested in what you all think the answers to these questions would be in the Brazilian context. I've deliberately talked about this at a more general level because I'm very conscious that I'm not an expert in Brazil, that on all of these issues there's great disagreement in Brazil right now, and it would be arrogant and presumptuous of me, I think, to say here's what I think Brazil or what Brazilian prosecutors ought to do with respect to any of these three questions. But I'm fairly sure many, if not all of you, have opinions on this, and I would love to hear some of those opinions, starting now. Let's see some hands. And I'm going to come down from up here because, again, this isn't supposed to be a lecture, so I'll wander. I think we have another microphone over there. I've got one here. Who will...
to come forward?
No. I'm going to come down just like, yeah, I'm going to come down, I'm going to walk around, and we'll have awkward, painful silence until someone is willing to get things going. Yay! Great. Kick us off.
Good morning, Professor. Well, I think I'm going to focus on the first question, right? I'm a federal prosecutor. I work at car wash in Rio, so I feel more comfortable with the first question. So I think we can say that criminal law is essentially about defining what is permitted and what is forbidden. I think we can all agree on that. And so it's essentially about what you can seriously expect from the person who is next to you. And so take this into consideration, what people think what people expect is important, because criminal law, after all, it's a way to analyze what's right and what's wrong. And this political scenario belongs and also influentiates the deterrence effect, especially in the way people see the sense of impunity. When you go after political office, you give back, you make a feedback that these people can be they will be responsibilized and they will be accountable or else. So I think public opinion should not be the focus, not a compass, but it has to be taken into consideration because it's closely related to the deterrence effect. If you don't signalize properly what you are doing and what is forbidden and in what extension and to whom this is forbidden and to whom it's not, you're going to fail. Criminal law is going to be pointless. So,
thank you. Others on this? Great, please.
So, adding to her point, on the other hand, when you talk about the judiciary power, we are like facing with our backs in the wall. Why? Because our National Code of Conduct forbids public manifestations about current case. So, and it's not rare when you see some judges making some comments on social media, receive a lot of criticism. In my case, for instance, what I used to do, so every time I have a big case, I just make public the decisions, because what I have to say is there. And in my opinion, if we talk a lot about big cases, in case of the judge, we may breach our impartiality. Not for me, but for the third view. I think for the judge, the situation is a little more sensitive.
Yeah, oh, please.
Só tentando somar ao que o colega falou, nesses casos de maior repercussão, eu não apenas disponibilizo as decisões, mas tento estabelecer com a assessoria de imprensa da Justiça Federal um breve resumo e colocar isso para os órgãos da mídia, mas especificando, destacando, enfatizando aqueles pontos fundamentais capazes de convencer. Embora nós tenhamos as nossas garantias, eu acho importante esse diálogo, sim, com a sociedade. E o que a colega do Ministério Público falou ali, eu também comungo com ela, daquele pensamento, e acrescentaria mais, a nossa legislação, ela tem um período para que você se desincompatibilize de alguns cargos públicos, caso você queira participar do processo eleitoral. E se isso talvez não devesse, pelo menos no Brasil, ser estendido mais, porque às vezes você vê alguns agentes do Ministério Público, do próprio Judiciário, querer fazer, sim, uma promoção pessoal pensando em carreiras futuras políticos eleitorais. Às vezes nós nos deparamos com algumas presenças muito fortes na mídia e não nos surpreendemos quando, dali a pouco, ela sai, a pessoa candidata a algum cargo eleitoral. Isso pode acabar tornando a opinião pública o norte do agir dela. Então, a gente tenta conjugar isso.
Yes, you have the microphone, right? Yes, please.
As we were talking yesterday, Professor, we as judges, we have an ethical code, so we can't talk about ongoing cases. So for us, think about relation with the media, it goes in a restrictive way. But while reading your test, I was thinking about when you talk about UGAS case and Mr. Miller situation, that he's extremely discreet. I think in Brazil, we should find a counterpoint because, as one of the texts says, it's important that the population knows about what's going on, how does the public institutions work, because if you want to ban the corruption here, we need the population needs to have the feeling that something's happening. Even the big fish are being punished. So I think it's important to find a middle way. We can't just make the investigation become too politicized that the prosecutors can get promoted. And of course, we are humans. They can think about going to politics. But we cannot just keep everything in secret, otherwise the opposition can undermine the investigations.
Did you want to add to that? Yeah. Please, and then I'll come over to you.
Okay, I agree with my colleague. I just would like to point that when you have a big case like car wash operation, for example, your life as a federal judge, your personal life can be destroyed, and sometimes the political field is the only way out. So I don't know if if it's impossible to a judge to become a politician. Maybe it could decrease the incentives to make a good job.
Neighbor Pontes, federal judge. I see as the traditional media is changing, the importance of the traditional media to influence the public opinion. So in general, and from the last decades, you have the power of those TV broadcasters that have enormous influence in the public opinion. And most of the time they were biased politically, and the general public would not a proper opinion, but the opinion that the politician and the economic power would like to impose. Mm-hmm. And nowadays I see that we are facing a different time with social media, and this new instrument could help to give a independent view, but on the other side, it has the dangers of fake news to influence the whole process wrongly. So I agree with her, we need a compromise, but we are facing a very difficult time about how the media could influence politically the outcome of those investigations.
Please.
I have a very restricted opinion on judges using social media when they are on relevant current cases. So I think we can think about institutional arrangements that limit or ban, like for quarentena, em português, não sei se, I don't know how to say this in English, but to ban them from running to electoral positions like for 2 years, after they leave the case, or even in places in the executive branch. You know, I have this restricted vision because we are in such a polarization, and every opinion of the judges and prosecutors is so relevant in the democratic dynamics. So I think that we can think about some limitation in this field.
Great. That provoked a bunch of hands, so that's great. I have thoughts on this, but I'm more interested in your thoughts, so continue.
I don't know if there is a problem about a judge or a prosecutor becomes a politician. I think the problem is that we think there is a social sense, common sense, that politicians are evil. They are bad people. So I don't think there's a problem that a judge or a prosecutor becomes a politician after some time. I think the problem is the social sense, the common sense about the politicians today. Not necessarily they are evil. They could be good people. We expect they could be good people. They could be great things for our country. So I put this thing that maybe it's a good thing. It's good for that.
Do you want to respond to that?
I have a very good opinion on politics, and I agree with you on that. My point is, how can you see a politician that is wearing robes And how can you see a politician that is making political activities while in prosecuting people? This is the evil side of the thing. Because once you are officially a politician, this is okay. You go to public opinion scrutiny and you are on the game in an open way. But on the other hand, maybe you are making your activity on political timing, but this is not open and this is not put to population scrutiny, even the political debate.
I'll give you a chance to reply to that, and then we've got someone in the back.
Okay, it makes sense, the honesty of the job of a judge or a prosecutor in doing this job before getting in the politician. But I still think that we can find some useful people who knows law, who try to do the right thing, trying to get in the politicians to make good things. So I still have some hope that that's a good way we can improve our laws, our government, our politicians, and everything.
Way back there.
Hi, Professor. My name is Amanda. I'm a professor from the University of Brasilia. I'm not a federal prosecutor, neither a judge, so maybe I won't be in the middle of this polarization here. My view would address your second question regarding the communication factor. My previous experience is on negotiation of leniency agreements, specifically on cartel cases, but they would obviously be considered for anti-corruption, leniency, and immunity agreements. So what I was thinking about the cornerstones of the leniency program. So first of them, the individuals that they do those infringements, they have to consider that they will be detected. They have to have the threat of detection. Second one, they need to think about severe punishment. They need to have the sense that if they infringe the law, they will have severe fines or jail time. And the third cornerstone of a leniency program would be the legal certainty, transparency, and predictability. So all of that, just to say that when we think about communication today, we need to think that the civil society does not have the legal understanding that maybe all of us here in this audience have. So if we think that if we go to the public side and speak almost only on legal terms, they won't have any understanding about what's going on, what is corruption and what's not corruption. And in the sense, this is transparency. This is what I think about communication. Communication is about transparency. So there might be limits or a gray zone about using social media, not using social media, using the communication service of the legal institution. So this is important for transparency in my point of view. And also because when you communicate and when you have this transparency, it has more waves on the civil society. So people understand what's going on. They detect more easily what's going on as corruption cases, and then they can also use hotlines for making people accountable for corruption cases as well. So based on those cornerstones, I would think that communication is essential for anti-corruption cases.
So let me take your comment there and let me draw a distinction, and then I want to get, but I think that's a useful point, which it might be useful to draw a distinction between different kinds of public communication that maybe I conflated too much in my opening remarks. And it's not a sharp distinction, but the distinction I want to draw is between transparency, or let's call it explanation, and advocacy. And you could have both of these things, you could have one of them, or you could have neither of them. But I think what you're describing is a form of communication that is an explanation in non-technical terms to the general public of what just happened. Right? So instead of just filing legal documents that say, today we executed the following search, or we convened a grand jury, that would be in the United States or whatever, it would explain this is what this means, that's what the significance is for the investigation and so forth, but that would stop short of attempting in some kind of broader way to advocate for a particular view or to emphasize how bad corruption is or the need for particular reforms. And again, I am not taking a position either way on any of this, but maybe when we have this conversation about communication, it would be a useful distinction to have in mind. That is, and I think this comes back to the comment we heard earlier from the judge, there's some kind of transparency or use of media that's basically, can we explain this in ways that non-lawyers, maybe even people who are not that well educated, can understand? And then there's advocacy. There's saying, Congress wants to pass this new law. If they do it, it will undermine our investigation. Block it, right? That's a different kind of communication from saying, let me explain to you what the significance is of this filing that we just submitted today, or we concluded a leniency agreement. You might not have heard of that. It's a new thing. Let me explain to you what a leniency agreement is and how it works. So with that potentially useful distinction, let me come back to hearing from all of you. I thought I saw, yes, a hand over here, please.
Hi, good morning. So I have a commentary and a question. So we read about Miller, and you commented also that he's not supposed to speak and he doesn't speak to the public. But I'm curious at the state level how prosecutors behave, because they're elected, so I believe that they feel they're obliged to, explain to the public what's going on. But in Brazil, I'd like to address a specific issue here, is that especially in the Supreme Court, or even in cases like Lava Jato, everything is TV broadcast or YouTube broadcast. So I think it makes a big difference in judgments, because the Supreme Court is discussing an issue, and actually, after a while, these Supreme Court members became very famous. Once I was in a bakery here in Brasilia, and Joaquim Barbosa, everyone started applauding him. So, he was on TV, during the whole day, and people were discussing what they said. And then he had a big discussion with another judge, and everybody was discussing that. So after they decided things should be broadcast, I think it's, it took that path and it's gone. So after that, you have to explain things because it's already in the public. And I know in the United States, things are very, very different. I know, for instance, in the California Supreme Court, their judgments, the moment they decide, the doors are closed. So it's totally different in Brazil when you see people discussing. So I think that in the way that we communicate with the public, even though you as a judge, you try to have maybe, you decide that you shouldn't make commentaries in your social media and everything, but if you're in a high profile case, everything you said in a hearing, maybe it's gonna be out there in the internet.
So the short and oversimplified answer to your first question is there are differences between the way federal prosecutors behave and the way state prosecutors behave that are likely due to the fact that state prosecutors are elected. They are much more overtly political. At the same time, there are still certain restrictions on what they can say. They're not supposed to transgress, partly because of concerns about the jury, right? If a case is ongoing and the prosecutor says a lot of stuff in public, that could contaminate the jury pool. But there have been certainly instances where prosecutors, especially at the state level, have gone up to the line and sometimes have gone over it in making very broad statements about cases that they really shouldn't have. Your point about the Supreme Court being televised, of course, this goes far beyond corruption or anti-corruption specifically, but absolutely it's related to this discussion. So the fact that these hearings are televised and the fact that the people involved, the justices, but also sometimes the prosecutors, become these celebrities is interesting. I mean, I more want to pose the questions to provoke conversation here without expressing very strong views. What I will say is, first of all, in the United States, as you may know, TV cameras are not allowed in the courtroom. at least at the Supreme Court, no TV cameras. Audio recording is permitted, so you can actually listen, but not as many people would just listen to the audio recording of a very long conversation. And the existing Supreme Court justices are adamantly opposed to allowing TV cameras in the courtroom. I think their concern is that it would create too much playing to the camera, that there were both the lawyers but also the justices. And there's this sense that it would be not good for the argument process if people were thinking maybe subconsciously which clever thing that I say might end up on the evening news or these days go viral in social media, as opposed to really trying to ask the lawyers. Now, my personal view, having spent some time in the US Supreme Court, is there's already a little too much showboating and asking, trying to get clever things to get a laugh into the argument. But that's very much the view. Now, to the more important aspect of your intervention, the fact that, and this nicely builds on some of the other comments, when, to some extent, judges, but I think more we're talking about prosecutors here, are open in this way, or using social media, or in the media, and so forth, it certainly raises their public profile in ways that may be good, may be bad. And I'm really interested in hearing what people think about this. And on the one hand, there may be concerns that people do start thinking about their public image or their future political career or whatnot too much. Maybe the attention goes to their head. Maybe it distorts their judgment. On the other hand, I could certainly see an argument that in a country where corruption is pervasive and people feel like they're just being crushed by all this, having some heroes may be a good thing. Maybe a good thing both for maintaining public support for the operation. It may also be good for giving people hope. Maybe it's not such a terrible thing that certain figures emerge as symbols of the fight against corruption. And the hope is that they can maintain the appropriate degree of humility and professionalism. And that is certainly assisted by television and social media and so forth. So I do think it again implicates this question, do we want I'll focus mostly on prosecutors. I think there would be more agreement that judges should not be out there and advocating the public. Should prosecutors be really like, we're behind closed doors, we speak through indictments, we speak through convictions, we speak through filings, and for the most part, we're not out there as public advocates? Or should, in some circumstances, these people assume more of a public profile? And again, there's variation, and I think TV cameras and social media feeds into that. Luana, I saw your hand there, please.
Maybe under like normal circumstances, we could expect a more discreet behavior from a prosecutor. But the car wash operation, and maybe also the Mensalão one, showed that we are living a very pervasive, a very systemic situation of corruption. Car wash showed that almost all important politicians are involved in bribery schemes. So there are many strong forces pushing against the corruption fight. So we are not living under normal circumstances. Our institutions are still learning how to deal with this kind of corruption, with pervasive kind of corruption that we have in Brazil. So maybe it's too naive to think that being discreet and being behind doors, prosecutors will succeed on this fight. So I think that now, in the moment we live, it's necessary to have a more aggressive and more and go to the public and try to have the public behind us, supporting. We know that historically we know that countries that went to a aggressive fight against corruption ended failing, mostly because the population at some point stopped supporting. So we try here not to follow the same bad example, not successful examples. We try to do something different, and I think that it was essential for the good results that the operation had so far, to have the public in our understanding what is happening and supporting the measures we take.
Where's the other microphone? There are a bunch of hands. So the microphone made its way over here, and I have it focused over here. So let me get a couple people over here, and then I'll come back to those of you here. I'm thrilled that so many people are jumping in. So to the gentleman behind you, and then to you.
Great. I'd just like to add something that I think there is a strong connection between transparency and the political bias. I think the more you can get from transparency on the side of when do we have to disclose a new fact? A car wash operation had a strong criticism on that. And even though I don't agree much that car wash operation had a political bias, that was a common criticism, saying, listen, you disclosed a new information right a week before an important political fact. We'd have an important voting on the day after, and you disclose a new search warrant. I don't know. So, and it's not clear for general public, even though all the explanation on the case itself, it's not clear for the public when or why the prosecution office had to disclose that new fact on that day. And that affects a lot this perception of political bias on an important corruption investigation. So we should think transparency as a tool to make sure that we don't have a political bias on important investigations, because we're having a good explanation. Prosecutors are going on the press, on the media, to explain, also the federal police, to have journalists specialized on these cases, playing full-time, following these cases. So I think the media is covering quite well and explaining quite well the case. So that's not the point. I think transparency should help more to explain why some decisions were made on that specific timing. So, yeah.
Acho que até seguindo pouco a linha. Sorry, I don't speak English very well. Seguindo pouco a linha, na Operação Lava Jato, uma das ferramentas que passaram a ser utilizadas como método para a eficiência da investigação foram as coletivas que passaram a ser dadas pelos colegas a partir da deflagração das operações. Então, os colegas sempre, como uma maneira de explicar à população o que ocorreu junto com a polícia, com os demais órgãos de persecução, quando tinha também a Receita Federal, os demais órgãos de controle, faziam e explicavam à população o que ocorreu. E isso se mostrou uma ferramenta de muita eficiência, porque trouxe a população para a cobrança para os demais, para que isso tornasse uma cultura favorável, para que isso passasse a que nós passássemos a cobrar, principalmente o judiciário, para que o caso passasse a andar com mais eficiência e passássemos a ter deferidas medidas, passássemos a ter deferidas prisões, e, enfim, passássemos a ter mais eficiência, coisa que antigamente a gente não tinha tanta eficiência como principalmente na Suprema Corte, em outras instâncias, foi a grande ferramenta. Tanto que nos manuais hoje que nós estudamos, essa questão das coletivas, essa questão do acesso à mídia. Porém, por outro lado, isso é uma situação para os investigados que ainda não têm a opinião do delito formada, que ainda não tem uma situação de as provas concluídas já estão expostos na mídia. Então, suponhamos que uma situação que eles não sejam condenados, não sejam acusados pelo Ministério Público, já estão sendo... então, eu gostaria de saber como, se nos Estados Unidos essa situação também ocorre e se existe algum método de controle, como é que vocês veem isso lá nos Estados Unidos, essa situação dessas coletivas, se isso existe e como é que vocês verificam essa situação que tem ocorrido aqui, que é uma coisa muito bem sucedida que ocorreu aqui na Operação Lava Jato, que tem ocorrido.
So I'll try to give a brief answer to the question at the end, but I think most of your intervention was very useful just in terms of your evaluation of the situation in Brazil. As I said earlier, in the US, in the federal system in particular, prosecutors don't give regular press conferences in the same way that the Lava Jato team here did. There are occasional press conferences, but usually they're to announce that charges have been filed or to announce that the case has been resolved. But often, sometimes that's done in a press conference, often it's just done in a memo. But there are not typically the kinds of regular press conferences to update everyone on what's been going on with the case. So the norms and practices are different. There is some attempt to inform the public, and so if there are charges filed against somebody, there may be a press conference or an announcement that today we filed charges against such and such a person. If convicted, they could face up to 38 years in prison or what have you. But there's not the same degree of detail, and there's certainly nothing like the social media presence. I mean, the U.S. Department of Justice doesn't sort of tweet out what's going on in the latest case. Certainly, Robert Mueller, I don't even know if he knows how to use Twitter. I mean, he doesn't tweet. So I guess in the U.S. it's not nothing, but it's just much more limited, and that has to do with the norms and ethics of prosecutorial conduct. To the extent that there's communication, it tends to be very factual communication. Although sometimes there's a little tinge of look how tough we're being. Those press conferences that say if convicted, this person could face up to 38 years are almost always grossly exaggerating the amount of prison time the person could actually get given their background and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of kind of advertisement or maybe a little bit of politics, you could even say, built into those announcements, but it's really just at the margin. So again, coming to Brazil as an American, one of the things that's really struck me is how much more communicative the Brazilian prosecutors, especially in the Lava Jato case, have been with the public. And to come back to the distinction that I made before, not just communication, not just let me explain to you what's happened, but advocacy. Right? This is what should happen. This is why our investigation is important. This is why the law needs to be reformed in the following ways. That's something that, as someone from the United States, when I first realized that was happening, I was like, whoa, that's different and not necessarily wrong. I think Luana makes a really terrific point that it's something I said before and I want to emphasize. Different countries in different circumstances may be suited to different norms of behavior. So I don't have a view one way or the other on whether what we see now in Brazil is kind of too much communication, not enough, or just the right amount. But it's very different. Maybe that's the thing I want to really emphasize. It's very different in ways that it should at least spark some self-reflection about why are we doing this? Is this the right thing to do? What are the advantages and disadvantages? And this is just a morning conversation. I'm not going to resolve this, but one of the reasons the organizers, I think, put together a session like this with all of you in the room is to start provoking some of those conversations about what's the right way to deal with this issue against the backdrop, as I emphasized in my opening remarks, of a setting where these kinds of anti-corruption investigations are inevitably political. And you're making even if your decision is not to get overtly involved in politics, that decision itself has potentially political implications. And it's just something one would need to think about and think through. I thought there were some hands over here. And please, the microphone's over there. Go ahead.
I'm Rodrigo Parente, federal judge. It's kind of different of what's been talked about now. It's kind of this social media heroes and the long-term corruption, anti-corruption measures. I think it's a risk of these so-called heroes or called heroes to become become a political, have a political office, because it may take a public opinion of, well, he was doing this because he wants a political gain. So I kind of leave a question, how the anti-corruption measures will not be undermined by this transition between regular civil office and the political office?
That's a fantastic question. I'd actually be interested in what other people have to say about that question. It gets, but Clara, you were making this point a little bit earlier, and you know, we're talking about Sergio Moro, right? Like maybe we could just admit that's like at least part of what we're talking about. And I think it raises a really interesting question. So to come back, Clara, to the point you were making before, one thing one could do as a matter of law or ethical regulations is to just have a rule. I mean, that if you have served in such and such a position, you may not serve in the following kinds of high-level executive positions or run for public office or whatever for a certain period of time. So again, one way you could address this concern that someone who's become an anti-corruption hero but who's accused of being partisan, taking a high-level position would undermine the credibility of the investigation is to say, look, people are human beings. They would be tempted by their personal ambition. We should just have a rule. You can't do it, especially maybe if you've been a judge. You've been a judge. If you want to go into politics, you can't do it right away. You've got to wait 2 years, 4 years, whatever. That would be one thing we could do. But there are some disadvantages to that. There might be some good reasons, as some other people have suggested. There might be some good reasons. We want people like this who really have emerged as anti-corruption heroes, who are deeply committed to that cause, who are deeply invested in it, to be able to move beyond their more limited ambit in the judiciary and the prosecution service to pursue broader public policy reforms that they couldn't achieve if they were in those limited positions. And if that's right, then we want to think, I think as your question invites us to think, well, if they want to make that transition, what could they do? If we're not going to ban it, what can one do to minimize the risk that the making of that transition will undermine the credibility of anti-corruption efforts? And I mean, I suppose I might have some thoughts on that, but I think it would be much more useful and productive to hear what you all think about that in the Brazilian context, because I do think it's a very difficult challenge. Was that a flash of a hand there? Excellent.
I think that from a broader perspective, thinking about the functionality of the system, of the legal system, I think it's very beneficial, it's very healthy to think about limitations to judges, as Clara suggested, a period of time after he goes away from the public service. So I think a limitation, it's healthy. But thinking in a particular way, thinking about Sergio Moro, about his situation, I really do believe in his sincerity. Like, I really do believe that he accepted the position because he wants to advance in a agenda against corruption. And it's also true that almost everything Sergio Moro did during the process, during the trial, is considered politically motivated by the defendants. Everything. Like the defense that Lula has tried everything before the Supreme Court and before all the tribunals and also the Supreme Court. Almost every day I work with cases before the Supreme Court, so almost every day we have habeas corpus, which is a action, I don't know how to say in English. Yeah. So almost every day they issue, they present an habeas corpus against everything the Moro did, since if Moro don't allow don't allow me to record my hearing, my interrogatório. Or Moro issued a decision against me. Everything is is considered politically motivated by many people and also especially by the defense. So everything he does is considered like that. Accepting this position was also considered, so I don't know if he had said no, I don't know, he would have continued being accused of being politically motivated.
Ok.
Yes, please.
Acho que ele precisa pegar o fone. Meu nome... Sou advogado, meu nome é Antônio Loyola. Só queria fazer uma consideração histórica sobre as 3 perguntas que o senhor fez, em relação a Ministério Público, juízes, opinião pública, comunicação e essa questão política. Voltando no tempo, os últimos 25 anos, nós tivemos aí 3 impeachments, 2 impeachments basicamente, e a comunicação, seja com o Ministério Público e os juízes, já no primeiro impeachment, há 25 anos do Collor, existia uma certa comunicação do que estava sendo decidido, não era televisionado, mas a população escutava pelo rádio. Então, talvez a população brasileira, a sociedade em geral, ela acostumou com esse tipo de questão que hoje está no Supremo sendo televisionado, e quero acreditar que influencia, a opinião pública vai influenciar, sim, seja a manifestação do Ministério Público até da Alta Corte. No que tange a questão dos juízes e até dos promotores na questão política, eu posso ter uma opinião um pouco diversa, e aqui não estou, pelo amor de Deus, nem afrontando os membros do Ministério Público, tampouco os membros dos magistrados, né? Mas nós tivemos há pouco uma corregedora nacional, Eliana Calmon, que, não sou eu que estou dizendo, ela já fez várias entrevistas dizendo que a opinião pública, sim, interfere no judiciário, interfere no Ministério Público, e que, se para chegar às casas mais altas, às cortes mais altas do judiciário, evidentemente que a questão política é relevante. O que eu quero chegar com isso? É que é inexorável que questões políticas e questões da opinião pública, elas são relevantes, seja para o magistrado, seja para os procuradores. Mas, naquilo que se vê em relação à comunicação, seja dos magistrados e até dos membros do Ministério Público, entendimento que eu tenho é que há que se ter um pouco de ponderação. Vejo que poderia ser um pouco, para determinados juízes, um pouco mais, poderiam se comunicar melhor, e aí não estou falando nem de ministros do Supremo, tampouco do STJ, ministros, juízes como um todo, já em relação aos membros do Ministério Público, seja a questão Lava Jato ou não, a própria atual Procuradora-Geral da República hoje tem uma comunicação um pouco melhor, mais comedida, e que não explora tanto essa situação, que, a meu entendimento, e obviamente a questão pessoal, fala menos e age mais. Seria só essa questão que eu queria colocar.
I'd just like to add something that what Mona said, that as the prosecutors were investigating the big fishes and a big scam of corruption, of course the media was important to keep their independence, and I imagine they were being threatened, so it's good that everyone knows who you are and what you are doing in terms of protecting the operation, the investigation. And the other thing that I would like to add about what Luana, Clara, and Arthur said about judges and prosecutors that go through politics. Of course, I agree with what you said, Arthur, that of course there are people that want to do good things for the government, as Luana emphasized, and maybe a solution could be a quarantine, as Clara said. We judges, when we want to start working as lawyers, we need to quit, and we have 3 years of quarantine to work as a lawyer in the area work. So maybe a period of time could be a solution.
I agree most with all my colleagues just said, but I think there's a broader thought to be brought here. So we are talking about how prosecutors and how judges must act or should act. However, what is our real corruption agenda? We are doing everything through prosecution, or should we thought about political measures, educational measures? I think when you goes only through prosecution, we could end up, as your reading said, like Italy or maybe like Thailand. So I think the agenda should be broader than only thinking through prosecution and judicial measures.
I think I'm going to get to the question in the back in just a second, but I want to just react to that. I think that's almost certainly right. I think everyone would agree that although prosecution is an absolutely necessary condition to deal with the problem of systemic corruption, it is not a sufficient condition, and that one needs other reforms. And in my lecture 2 days ago, I very briefly outlined some of them: reforms to the political system, the electoral system, media law, criminal procedure law, and so forth. I suppose that the question, or a question that I think is interesting to consider, and that is really the one that one of the ones I wanted us to consider here, is to what extent those responsible for the prosecution piece of the effort should get involved in this other stuff. And there are contrasting perspectives. One view says the English metaphor would be stay in your lane. You're responsible for figuring out if the criminal laws have been violated, and if they have, you need to bring the case and put those people in jail. The broader context, the big political fight over campaign finance rules, don't get into it. And if you do get into it, what you're going to do is you're going to undermine your credibility as an independent, politically neutral prosecutor, or I suppose potentially judge, but mainly prosecutor, and that you will maintain your credibility if you focus on that, do your job, and let others, these politicians, deal with the broader agenda. There's a contrary view, however, that says these people who have been working as prosecutors in these specialized anti-corruption task forces, or in other countries in specialized anti-corruption agencies, have developed, first, an unusual expertise in the problem. By prosecuting the cases, they also see where the systemic institutional weaknesses are. Second, a real passion for the issue, which may be crucial to pushing forward with reforms. And third, potentially this folk hero status, which may give them unusual leverage to be able to move the conversation about the broader reforms. And that you're not going to get these broader reforms, this contrary argument goes, unless these people have the ability to get involved in the broader political process, perhaps by communicating not just in a transparency explanation mode, but in an advocacy mode, or even by themselves going into politics. So again, without taking a position on how Brazil should resolve this tension, I do think that's the tension that I hope everyone in this room and beyond is thinking about. Right? There's a real danger and risk to having anti-corruption prosecutors go beyond their narrow focus on enforcing the criminal law. But there's also a danger and risk in limiting them in that way and not allowing them to go beyond that. And I think that's the conversation that many people in Brazil, I assume, right now are having on precisely that point. We're almost out of time, but I know there's someone who's been waiting in the back, so let me get that question in before we wrap up.
Oh, thank you, Professor. I'm Victor Hugo. I'm an auditor at the Federal Court of Accounts, as I said yesterday. And at the TCU, the Federal Court of Accounts, we have a say that auditor speaks in the process. We don't have that. We have limitations to speak to the press and something like that. And I would like to make some points that, on one hand, not only judges and auditors need to be unbiased, but also they should appear unbiased. I think that's one point. But on the other hand, in Brazil at least, there is need to raise some public awareness about the process and the investigations that are being made. And especially in a sensitive case. moreover, the defendant's lawyers, they are not limited to go to the media, to make their points to the press. And, well, I think that there could be an unbalanced situation between prosecution and defense. I may think, that's what I think, that one possible solution to this problem could be the full transparency of the procedure, of the criminal procedure, after the investigations are finished. You know, when all the evidence have been collected, the prosecution has already made their case and filed the case, so there could be the full transparency of those evidence. And, well, it could be also advisable for press releases to explain in a non-technical language about those evidence. That's what I think. That's what I defend at TCU, at least.
Terrific. I'll just may say one quick word about that and wrap up. Well, two quick words. The first is that, as I think you recognize as you make the comment, there's some tension between your first point, which is that prosecutors and judges, like auditors, need to not only be unbiased but appear to be unbiased, with your second point, that they may often need to talk to the public and advocate to the public, because it's precisely the talking to the public and especially advocating to the public that creates risks of appearance of bias, at least potentially. Now, the second thing you say about the desire for full transparency, I think that's intriguing. Obviously, we couldn't have full transparency. There are some things that prosecutors maybe need to keep confidential. If, for example, they got a tip-off from an anonymous whistleblower, they might not want to say where they got that information in the first place. The point that I wanted to make is to actually connect that observation, the desire for full transparency about everything that transpired, with the conversation we were having yesterday about settlement. They might not necessarily seem immediately connected, and I don't know what the Brazilian situation is, but very often in the United States, when there are these negotiations between prosecutors and corporate defendants in particular about DPAs or NPAs, one of the things they're negotiating is exactly what is the statement of facts and recitation of the circumstances and the actual crimes that were violated going to be in the document. And so actually, there's some tension there, actually, between the desire to settle the case and the desire to have full transparency, because very often the defendant won't want to disclose absolutely everything, and they won't necessarily want to admit to certain crimes that, let's say, have a worse reputational consequence. So, for example, it's often considered worse for the firm's reputation to acknowledge having paid bribes than to acknowledge having had accounting errors, even if the accounting errors were about disguising bribes. So oftentimes there will be some negotiation in that process. Are we going to admit that we paid bribes, or are we just going to admit that bribes might have been paid, but really we just didn't record them properly in our books? So I think I'm glad, actually, it's a nice point in which to end, because in some ways that point highlights a connection between the conversation we're having today and the conversation we're having yesterday, and perhaps some tension, at least on that point, between the desire for full transparency and the desire to settle cases. But really, I think it was a great conversation. Thank you all for your interventions. Obviously, again, this format is not the ideal format for really going deep and engaging with each other in an intense way about some of the controversial issues, but I hope that the conversation and the many very useful interventions from the audience will provoke further conversations over lunchtime and beyond about these important issues, and it's just very encouraging to see how much thoughtfulness and self-reflection there is on these hard questions in Brazil. I apologize for running 3 minutes over time, but we will end here. Have a great lunch, and I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow for our final session, when we'll talk about the role of democratic elections in the control of corruption.
Voltaremos às 2 da tarde com a palestra do Dr. Eric Navarro.